it's really important to be ambitious. I think it's important to have more balls in the air than you can catch at the end when it all comes down to it and you have to ship a game. But certainly you can go too far.
How do you follow up a classic? If you're fortunate enough to make something beloved, you won't get a chance to rest before you hear those fateful 2 words. What's next? For Halo, Xbox's killer app, a sequel wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. Once the whole success of a platform rests on one game, the game has to be there. With the groundwork now laid, surely it would be easier to make the next entry in the Halo series, right?
Jason has this phrase that he uses for how things come together at the end, and he says that it's like assembling a cathedral out of a hurricane.
This line stuck with me during the making of Halo 2 documentary. It's in my mind whenever I think about this game. Things had changed a lot since Combat Evolved hit store shelves in 2001. Where that game faced the curiosity of the gaming world and the uncertainty of the new console, Halo 2 saw a very different gaming landscape. Xbox was now established and had taken itself online, and Halo had become a household name in the gaming community. Expectations were high, be they from Microsoft, the players, or from Bungie themselves. Halo 2 is the entry that I have probably the greatest affinity for. It was the first game I owned for the original Xbox in 2005. It's had a soft spot in my heart since the first time I beat it, and for years it was my undisputed favorite of the series. As a child, I knew nothing about the troubled development or the criticisms the game faced at launch. As far as I knew, it was just gaming perfection. 17 years later, I have a far more critical eye and with greater perspective about its history, I want to see how Halo 2 holds up. Even more so than its predecessor, it's important to understand how Halo 2 came to be and why it was released in the state it was. Everything has to be bigger and better than what came before. That's the takeaway whenever something's a runaway success. If that next thing doesn't expand beyond what you knew before, then it can be disappointing. Bungie had ambitions for Halo 2, but ambition can be a slippery slope. As I discussed in my last video, Halo 1's development and Bungie's financial woes led to many changes. The game was once made with Mac and PC in mind. The campaign fundamentally changed multiple times during development, and the multiplayer component was thrown together just a few months before release. Halo 2 didn't have this level of uncertainty. From moment one, it was a first-person shooter made specifically for the Xbox with both a single-player campaign and a multiplayer component, which this time would take advantage of Xbox Live. With a clear idea of what the game would entail and a group of developers familiar with each other, things seemed to be looking up. All that was left was to actually develop the game. Bungie's goal was in line with fan expectations, to be bigger and better.
The copy of the script, the cinematic script for Halo, this document needs to talk to programmers and artists and animators and everybody. This is 160 pages worth of cinematics. That's kind of crazy if you just think about it on its own. But when you look at a game which is 15 levels long and with a couple protagonists and a fairly complex story arc, I mean, when you need to drive the player's experience for 20 hours of gameplay, say, 120 minutes of cinematics doesn't really seem that out of proportion. But just to look at it prima facie, it's pretty daunting. You think, my God, you're making a feature film.
Halo 2 was clearly meant to be bigger than its predecessor, but with so many ideas being thrown around, it quickly became too big.
Yeah, I don't know if we're crazy or stupid or we just like good stories or what, but we certainly worry about that a lot more than you might think we'd have to in a game that's mostly just about action and about not thinking.
Bungie plowed ahead, this time toward a presentation at E3 2003. The documentary describes how this process was yet another area where Bungie simply went too far. The development focus shifted to having an impressive demo showcase at E3 to build hype.
Trade shows are useful because they make you get your shit together.
It's important for us to get excited about what we get done for E3 because we need to build that excitement up and go.
Bungie said the demo was playable and that Joe Staten would be playing it live on stage, much to the delight of the attendees.
This is a real-time feed. No smoke and mirrors, pre-recorded bullshit.
The demo showed off new mechanics such as dual wielding and vehicle hijacking alongside new enemy and vehicle types. Bungie made a great first impression, but at quite a cost. Remember how Sergeant Johnson said the demo would have no smoke and mirrors? That was a good one. The demo, other than deliberately misleading the consumers, also showed Bungie misleading themselves.
We came back with E3 with actually less than what we wanted to. We came back from E3 with a demo. We did not come back from E3 with a playable part of a level. That was really bad, actually. That wasn't the goal.
Years later, they admitted that the graphics engine used for the demo would never have worked on the original Xbox's limited hardware. Bungie had spent a year of development all for nothing. They had to scrap the graphics engine and start the game over from scratch. Their ambitions for Halo 2 had to become smaller yet again.
Right about at that moment, Pandora's box was opened, and decisions which were engraved in stone were rethought.
We messed up. Like, we didn't have the design down, we didn't have the story down.
And then everything that wasn't essential, all these things that we just loved to see in the game, they get put on the bottom of this list, and we start hacking them off.
Here comes the knife out of the script. What's important? That isn't, goodbye, my lovely child.
Every idea had to be condensed or tossed entirely, and compromise after compromise was made to give the game some kind of through line. Ultimately, the game had to be ready by November 2004, with both single-player and multiplayer components that had to outshine their predecessors. Much like with Combat Evolved, they only had months to craft a classic, but with much greater expectations and a much larger spotlight this time. Bungie crunched hard, and Halo 2 would release for the Xbox in November 2004. It was time to see the fruit that their months of hard labor bore. This is Halo 2. It's immediately noticeable that Halo 2 is definitely bigger than Combat Evolved. The presentation was already a standout feature in the first game, and Halo 2 improves on this greatly from moment one. The increased scale isn't just seen visually, but in the voices that you hear.
There was only one ship.
One? Are you sure?
Yes. They called it the Pillar of Autumn.
In the opening cutscene, you hear the voices of established actors like Keith David and Michael Wincott, each voicing key Covenant characters. Halo 2 sought to rectify an area that Halo 1 lacked completely, characterization of the Covenant. You're taken aboard High Charity, the Covenant Holy City, for a trial. An orange-clad elite general is on trial in front of the Covenant High Council, led by 3 prophets: Truth, Mercy, and Regret. Our orange elite has been deemed a heretic after failing to stop the destruction of Halo in the first game. The Covenant's religious devotion to Halo is also introduced as a prominent plot point here, as is the term Great Journey, which describes their goal of activating Halo. After this opening cutscene, we finally catch up with Master Chief, who's made his way aboard Cairo Station, a UNSC space station orbiting Earth. You're taken through a much quicker tutorial section before meeting Sergeant Johnson, who was previously just another recurring Marine in Combat Evolved, but is now a key plot-related character. Halo 1 had only 4 plot-related characters, and Halo 2 widens the scope considerably in this regard, giving the UNSC more named characters along with adding the Covenant side of the story. The Covenant story is intercut with the UNSC's in the lead up to Cairo Station, our first gameplay mission. While Master Chief is awarded for his bravery and devotion at the first Halo, our orange elite is stripped of his armor and branded with a mark of shame for his failure at the same place. The two characters are juxtaposed from the beginning of Halo 2's campaign, as they would be throughout. Commander Miranda Keyes, daughter of Captain Keyes, receives an award on his behalf from Lord Hood, the head of the UNSC. More big names in the voice cast here, with Julie Benz voicing Keyes and Ron Perlman voicing Lord Hood. The Covenant arrive at Earth and begin attacking the UNSC's line of defense around the planet. It's not really clear how the Covenant found Earth, especially since this game takes place so soon after Halo 1, where Captain Keyes' greatest fear was that the Covenant would discover the human home planet.
Master Chief, defend this station.
Yes, sir. I need a weapon.
Right this way.
Cairo Station immediately shows off new assets and mechanics for Halo 2. The first 2 weapons you pick up are the SMG, the game's assault rifle replacement, and the battle rifle, Halo 2's closest replacement to Halo 1's almighty pistol. You can also pick up the Magnum, Halo 2's pistol, but it's far less effective than Halo 1's and much more in line with what you'd expect from a typical video game sidearm. New to Halo 2 is the dual wielding mechanic, which the game's cover art showcases with 2 SMGs. Dual SMGs is probably the most common and effective combination of weapons, but you can mix and match with several weapons from both the UNSC and the Covenant. This is a fun mechanic that you can use in campaign, but I personally find it to be much more effective in multiplayer. In campaign, I rarely actually use dual wielding on any difficulty higher than easy. I just use the battle rifle if I have it on hand. It's a 3-round burst weapon, and it was perhaps its most effective in Halo 2. Bungie definitely did a better job balancing the primary weapons this time around, but for my money, the BR is the undisputed king in Halo 2, both in single player and multiplayer. Cairo Station is similar to Pillar of Autumn from Halo 1. It keeps things very simple, following linear paths through a UNSC ship. It's meant to keep things simple so you can get a feel for the gameplay. It's instantly notable how much better Halo 2 feels to play than its predecessor. It's much faster and movement feels far more fluid. I always think of Halo 1's jumping when I think about the biggest ways Halo 2 feels different. Halo 1's jumping feels so rigid and restrictive, but Halo 2 just feels more freeing, I guess. It doesn't feel like gravity's pulling you back down as soon as you press the A button. It actually feels like a jump would and should feel. Like Halo 1's opening level, in this opening stage you encounter only elites and grunts in combat. Elites are more expressive now, speaking English to the player in the middle of combat. They also feel easier to kill, something I can say for all the returning Covenant enemies in this game, excluding Hunters, who had an easily exploitable weakness in Combat Evolved that is absent in Halo 2. The time to kill across the board feels shorter, which extends to the multiplayer as well. At Cairo Station, you watch helplessly as the Covenant detonate bombs at other UNSC stations, and you realize the Covenant have brought a similar bomb on board the Cairo. In the second half of the mission, you walk through space to get to the other end of the station where the Covenant have placed their bomb. You encounter some elites with jetpacks along the way, and meet buggers for the first time. They're actually called drones, but you would only know that from reading this game's instruction manual. Buggers only carry a plasma pistol or a needler, and while these weapons individually in the hands of an AI aren't too threatening, they can take you out pretty quickly when they swarm you, even on normal, which is the difficulty I usually play Halo on. Once you fight your way through the drones and down the elevator, it's time to defuse the bomb. The cutscene that follows is an iconic Halo 2 moment that was first glimpsed in the game's reveal trailer. Halo 1 often had to replace levels with expository cutscenes to move the story forward, and while Chief giving the Covenant back their bomb isn't an expository cutscene, it is another example of a cutscene replacing a cut level.
Because the original plan was to have a level after this one.
Oh, yeah.
Called Covenant Ship.
Covenant Ship.
And the Master Chief, much like he did in the announcement trailer for Halo 2, there was no bomb. He would just man up, pop the airlock, bam, land on the Covenant ship, tear it apart from the inside.
Right. But instead, you did probably one of the most amazingly ridiculous cutscenes in the history of games.
Well, I figure if you're gonna cut a level, this is the way to cut it.
A similar mission concept to this cut level would be showcased in Halo Infinite's opening mission 17 years later, but unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be for the troubled Halo 2. What this cutscene does do effectively is show a grander scale than anything in Halo 1. Halo 1's cutscenes were very in-engine, rarely showing anything that couldn't be programmed into the gameplay itself. Halo 2 sets itself apart by immediately showing Master Chief doing something Halo 1 simply couldn't accomplish. It's still disheartening that we weren't able to play through this level to experience it ourselves, but that's just another what-if for Halo 2. Chief regroups with the UNSC and the fight's taken to Earth, where the Prophet of Regret has set up shop in New Mombasa. It's noted that the Covenant fleet he arrives with is curiously small, implying he's arrived for a different purpose than a full-fledged invasion of the human homeworld. In fact, Cortana later notes that Regret was unaware entirely of the human presence on Earth prior to his arrival. Chief leads a resistance against the invading Covenant force, which unleashes a new weapon to combat the UNSC, the Scarab. The Scarab shoots down Chief's ship, and he and his squad have to fend off Covenant forces by the crash site in our next mission, Outskirts. Outskirts and its follow-up mission, Metropolis, are missions I've had a soft spot for my whole life. Whenever I didn't know what else to do as a kid, I'd boot up Halo 2 and begin with Outskirts because I loved it so much. Today, these two Earth missions conflict me. On one hand, the novelty of defending Earth from the Covenant for the first time is exciting, but these two missions are also where Halo 2's level design begins to suffer. Outskirts starts with Chief and his Marines holed up in a courtyard defending against wave after wave of Covenant forces. There's no actual forward progress happening here, you just have to wait in the same spot and get through each wave before you can actually move forward. At this point, I'm used to wave defense sections in video games, but I feel like Halo in particular is at its least compelling from a gameplay standpoint in sections like this where you just have to wait. This mission introduces the mounted chain turret for Chief to use, which helps mow down enemies but has limited horizontal range. You can also swap weapons with ally characters now, and when I play this mission, I always steal Johnson's sniper rifle. I enjoy how unhappy he is when I do it.
That hurts, Chief. That hurts real bad.
You finally move on to the next section of the level after hunters break through the door. It's no Halo 1 pistol, but I always use the mounted turret to shred those hunters quickly. You move on to the next area where we see a variant of the Jackals. This is something I will never forgive Bungie for.
Yeah, this ain't good! Why? Why couldn't it have been me? I do now. I do now. Here they come.
In conclusion, fuck Sniper Jackals. Anyway, once you get past the Sniper Jackal section, you meet up with a group of Marines and embark on your first vehicle section of Halo 2. You have an option here. You can join Marines on the Warthog or steal a Ghost for the final stretch of the level. I usually take the Warthog so my Marine can be on the turret in the back and give me support. You make your way through the tunnels to finish the level, and as you exit the tunnel, you transition directly into the next level, Metropolis. Halo 2's mission structure differs from Halo 1's in a few ways. For one, the game has 15 levels compared to Halo 1's 10, but that can be a bit misleading. The first level is just a cutscene, and the second level is just a tutorial, so the game actually only has 13 true levels, and most of them are much shorter than your average Halo 1 level. Halo 2 often splits one big level into two smaller ones, presumably because it can't fit the entire area into one level thanks to the hardware limitations. The two Earth levels, Outskirts and Metropolis, are the first example of this. Metropolis opens just outside the tunnel where Outskirts ended. This feels like a way to make the game seem bigger and longer than it actually is, while also working around the technical limitations of the original Xbox. Standing between you and the Scarab is a bridge full of Covenant resistance. To help you push through, Johnson gives you a Scorpion tank. The game clearly wants you to use the tank, but it does leave a Warthog off to the side if you'd like to get through the level more quickly. I'm sure speedrunners are very thankful for that, and so am I. You're joined by a pair of Marines voiced by David Cross and Michelle Rodriguez, more big-name voice talent in Halo 2. The Scorpion handles far better than it did in Halo 1, which is true for pretty much all the vehicles in Halo 2. You encounter ghosts, banshees, and wraiths on your journey across the bridge, and this introduces another new mechanic to the game. Covenant vehicles now have a secondary explosion after they're destroyed. You've got a few seconds to get clear, and there is a warning sound to tip you off before it's too late. It's an enjoyable wrangle that keeps you on your toes, and it's not the only new vehicle mechanic in Halo 2. After crossing the bridge, you head back into the tunnels for some more tight quarters combat before the level finally opens back up. You get the opportunity to use a Warthog Gauss turret in the next section for the very first time. The Gauss is a one-shot turret with a few second cooldown period, and it's deadly against both infantry and vehicles. It's a great inclusion and a fun expansion of vehicle capabilities in Halo 2. The next sequence through the heart of New Mombasa is another vehicle showcase and an opportunity to show off the other new vehicle mechanic, hijacking. This feature was shown off in the E3 demo, and I'm very glad they kept it after scrapping the original engine. In Halo 1, you'd have to kill Covenant to take their vehicles, and you'd have to risk destroying the vehicles in the process. Here, you can simply take it from them if you time it right, holding X to climb aboard and kick them off. If you're not careful though, elites and brutes can do it to you as well, another way the game keeps you on your toes. After the vehicle section, it's finally time to take down the Scarab. After a lot of waiting. You see some scripted interactions, including one where the Scarab destroys the Scorpion. The game really did a great job in these two missions establishing the threat of the Scarab and making you excited at the opportunity to finally take it down. But unfortunately in execution, taking it down isn't nearly as exciting as it should be. You have to sit and wait for the Scarab to pass you, then you have to walk down to the very end of the harbor before the Scarab finally stops and lets you board. You can try and jump aboard while it's moving, but that can be easier said than done. You're also left with ample amounts of power weapons and ammo, letting you clear out most of the Covenant before the Scarab even stops. Once you board, you just have to clear out the enemies below to end the mission. When the following cutscene starts, the Scarab is already disabled and falling apart. What exactly happened here? Years later in the Halo 3 making of, Bungie employees admitted that the implementation of the Scarab left a lot to be desired. It's evident that they weren't happy with the ultimate execution of this concept, and as a player, I'm not either. It's a disappointing end to a fun series of opening missions. The end of Metropolis is notable for its score, a new rendition of the main Halo theme. The main theme plays during the earlier bridge sequence, but we get a new version during the final Scarab sequence, the Mjolnir mix. Halo 2's score consists almost entirely of new tracks, but even this repeated track from Halo 1 sets itself apart. The inclusion of rock in Halo 2's score sets it apart in a great way, thanks to the electric guitar prowess of Steve Vai, who worked with Mario O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore to give the Halo 2 score a rock infusion that persists throughout. The Mjolnir mix is probably what most people think of when they think of Halo music, apart from the monk chants. This track was so popular that it ended up making its way into Guitar Hero 3 a few years later. I'll have more to say on the music of Halo 2 as we go, but I couldn't go without giving this track some love. This level's ending cutscene features another iconic Halo moment, as In Amber Clad follows Regret's cruiser through a portal before the blast decimates New Mombasa, ultimately setting up the events of Halo 3 ODST. This marks the end of the Earth missions, and while I enjoy all three of these opening missions, they represent a lot of the issues that I have throughout Halo 2. All three levels are extremely linear, particularly Metropolis. Even the vehicle sections in Metropolis feel incredibly confined, and the on-foot sections put you back inside tunnels and buildings with only one real pathway. This playthrough, I was already becoming annoyed by the level design just 3 missions in. Meanwhile, Bungie had their own idea of how to shake the game up. As a 7-year-old who just wanted to shoot aliens, I skipped every cutscene in Halo 2. This continued until I skipped one cutscene too many and saw myself holding an energy sword all of a sudden. I saw a squad of elites in front of me, and I did the only thing I knew how to do. I slaughtered them. I was confused why they weren't shooting back at me until I finally got it. I was one of them now. Halo 2's twist to rival Halo 1's flood reveal sees you assuming control of a second playable character, the disgraced elite from the beginning of the game. Stripped of his armor, the naked elite's brought before the prophets and given an opportunity at redemption.
What use am I? I can no longer command ships, lead troops into battle.
Not as you are, but become the Arbiter. And you shall be set loose against this heresy with our blessing.
This cutscene does a lot of Halo 2's story's heavy lifting. It shows the power dynamic within the Covenant more clearly than ever.
The Council decided to have you hung by your entrails and your corpse paraded through the city. But but ultimately the terms of your execution are up to me.
I am already dead.
Indeed.
He knows deep down Arbiter is not a heretic, so he gives him an opportunity to silence the true face of heresy, a rogue elite referred to as the heretic leader. Truth plays some of the heretic leader's message, but cuts it off before he reveals what the Covenant's great journey actually is. The prophets explain in no uncertain terms that the Arbiter will die doing his duty, but that he can redeem himself in the eyes of the Covenant and continue serving them in the process. He obliges.
What would you have your Arbiter do?
Arbiter meets the Shipmaster, your main elite ally in these missions. You see how the Arbiter is perceived by his squad mates. His mark of shame can never be hidden by his armor, but he still earns their respect throughout. The elites still display unwavering fanaticism toward the Covenant, never questioning their orders to take out the heretic leader. The developer commentary notes that there were mixed feelings within Bungie about the inclusion of the Arbiter. It seems that Joe Staten was the driving force behind the inclusion of this character in gameplay, and he perceived it to be Halo 2's big twist.
As much as I think we all have mixed feelings about the Arbiter decision,
Yes.
and we absolutely didn't execute on it in the way that we really wanted to, but Halo 2, because we made this choice, I mean, all of a sudden just blew the doors open on the Covenant in this interesting way that now in Halo 3, I think we can go back to the Master Chief, that singular perspective, and we, just as people making the game, know so much more about that other side of the story. We can create something that's richer, and I think people who played Halo 2, it's kind of this, we took the knock, we made the investment, and then I think we're a lot better off for it.
From a story standpoint, I certainly agree with Staten's reasoning here. But from a gameplay standpoint, well, the Arbiter's first playable mission, named after him, features only Covenant combatants. You fight alongside Covenant soldiers and against Covenant separatists. As a result, there are no human weapons in this mission or the following one. You spawn with the energy sword and the plasma rifle. It's your first opportunity to really use the sword. The sword's a one-hit kill melee weapon if you can lunge with it, which Halo 2 very much wants you to do. The range of the lunge in Halo 2 is absurd. It's the closest thing to Halo 1's pistol in terms of being unbalanced or silly. The lunges feel even more absurd in multiplayer, especially when they're used against you, but they're undeniably satisfying to do yourself. The carbine is a semi-auto precision weapon, and it's great for getting headshots. If your aim is true, it's a one-hit kill on a grunt and can kill an elite with its shields drain with one headshot. It's especially useful later in the game against brutes. In the Arbiter missions, I tried to have a sword with the carbine as often as possible as my primary loadout. The Arbiter is a mostly unremarkable mission. It's undeniably strange to play as an elite for the first time, but that's a novelty that doesn't really translate to the gameplay. It doesn't really feel like Chief and Arbiter play differently outside of Arbiter's built-in active camouflage, which only lasts for a limited time before it needs to recharge. The differences in gameplay end up being more due to the enemies that Arbiter fights and the weapons he's limited to, rather than the way he actually feels to play. This mission largely consists of linear corridors and doesn't really contain much advancement in the story. You ultimately pursue the heretic leader outside the facility, leading to a Banshee sequence where you're aided by an ally Phantom. The Banshee sequence is fun, but there is a lot of sitting around waiting for the Phantom, which slows the level down. In subsequent playthroughs, if you know where the heretic leader went, you can fly straight there and save yourself the time, which is what I usually do. The sequence is notable for more rock music, this time from a third party. The instrumental for Follow by Incubus plays, while the full version is available on the official soundtrack for the game. It's just another example of how Halo 2 was able to be bigger in just about every way. Much like the previous two missions, the Arbiter is the first half of the two-mission set. In the next mission, Oracle, the Shipmaster notes a familiar stench inside the facility. You see and hear something very familiar beneath you as the heretics are taken out by something. Moments later, you get to fight the returning Flood. The game never really explains why the Flood are in this facility, as I'm pretty sure the facility isn't part of the Halo ring, but sure, the Flood are back. In my opinion, this is the game where the Flood are least enjoyable to fight, unfortunately. It's more difficult to get a headshot on them than it was in Halo 1, so headshot weapons aren't as viable as before. The primary weapon to use as the Arbiter is the sword, which takes less energy than it does to kill a standard enemy type. A good secondary weapon that makes its playable debut in this level is the Sentinel Beam. Sentinels are back, and you can use their weapons against both them and the Flood now. Be careful though, if you kill a Flood, be sure to destroy their carcass with your sword, because they can be reanimated this time. The carrier forms have also been tweaked from Halo 1, now exploding where they stand upon contact rather than going flying and not exploding until they land. Oracle unfortunately grinds to a halt almost immediately. You get stuck on a very slowly descending elevator for several minutes as waves of Flood and Sentinels attack you. It gets dull and repetitive almost immediately and goes on for far too long. Once again, the worst stretches of Halo campaigns to me are when you're not able to move forward. It's far more interesting from a gameplay perspective when you can use the space around you rather than being confined and having to wait for the game itself to move you forward. It feels like you're being herded rather than making your own way through the level. Once the elevator finally lands, you enter another brief section of the facility where heretic stragglers are fighting against the Flood. You fight off a few waves of each before you reconnect with your squad, and you almost reach the heretic leader before he locks himself behind a shield door. Arbiter, though, has a plan.
I'm going to cut it. Get everyone back to the ships.
Cutting the cable is a fun scripted sequence, even though you don't really feel the change from a gameplay perspective. It certainly doesn't feel like the ground beneath your feet is going into free fall, and you're quickly back in a Banshee chasing the heretic leader again. The final stretch of this level is backtracking through the entire area from the previous level, back to the hangar where the heretic leader is trying to escape on a fighter ship. Once you reach him, he introduces you to the Oracle.
Who has taught you these lies? The Oracle.
Hello, I am 343 Guilty Spark. I am the monitor of Installation 04.
He asks the Oracle to explain Halo to the Arbiter before immediately shooting at the Arbiter. This has always perplexed me. From what we know about this character, he's tried to get other members of the Covenant to defect, and he succeeded with many of them. You'd think he'd at least try to get the Arbiter on his side. Arbiter was a high-ranking elite commander, and he was publicly shamed by the Prophets and the Council. He's got more reason to defect than most, and he'd be a valuable ally. But no, the heretic leader decides to fight him, and we get the first of a new feature in Halo 2, boss fights. Well, to call this fight or any of the others in this game boss fights would probably give them too much credit. This is a fight against a jetpack elite with the added twist of 2 holograms meant to confuse you. I've played enough to know who he is immediately, and I was able to kill him with my sword within seconds. It's certainly not a boss fight in the traditional sense. After the fight, Charteris arrives to bring Guilty Spark to the Prophets, and the Arbiter joins him in leaving the facility, ending our first batch of Arbiter missions. Regret's fleet exits slipspace, followed closely by the humans. Miranda asks where they are, and the camera pans around to show us as Cortana reveals the answer.
That is another Halo.
Say what?
There's a real lack of fanfare in the presentation of this new Halo. They attempt to make the moment seem shocking with a humorous spit take from Johnson, but this moment doesn't carry much weight. The cutscene progresses so quickly that boots are on the ground on the new Halo, christened Delta Halo, within a couple minutes, and the Covenant are somehow already set up on the ring even though the 2 factions arrived at the same time. Chief is dispatched to the ring along with a squad of ODSTs making their first appearance in the series. They're differentiated from Marines by their armor, but behave just the same. Chief starts the level with the rocket launcher, taking out all the Covenant turrets at the LZ. Here we see the rocket launcher's lock-on feature, which feels more accurate in Halo 2 than in any game that followed. It's super effective against both vehicles and turrets, and as a result, it's my favorite rocket launcher in the series. After you clear the LZ, you have a Warthog section followed by an enjoyable Scorpion section. Unfortunately, these are your last opportunities to use these vehicles with Chief in Halo 2. The level makes you go on foot for the final stretch. There isn't much story progression happening in this level either, leaving that to the next mission. Your objective is still to find and kill Regret, and in this level you do learn that he's in a lake temple. These 2 missions are your journey to that temple, and Delta Halo ends with a forest fight, which is highlighted by one of my favorite pieces of Halo 2's score, in Amberclad. This is one area where I do actually prefer Halo 2 Anniversary. A few tracks on Anniversary soundtrack are superior to their original versions in my opinion, and I prefer In Amberclad's remake, Trapped in Amber. The final encounter in this level sees Chief confront some elite honor guards donned in special headgear. You fight them in this mission and the next, and their inclusion serves a story purpose a few missions down the line. Delta Halo stops right here, and we get a cutscene to transition us into the next mission. In this cutscene, Cortana translates Regret's sermon to reveal his intention. Take a wild guess what his intention is. Keyes and Johnson split off to search for the ring's index, while Chief continues his mission to assassinate the Prophet. Regret is one of my favorite missions in Halo 2. Even though it's the second half of a 2-mission set, Regret actually feels like its own mission that gets a chance to breathe and develop without dragging like Halo 1's longer missions did. It effectively combines gameplay and story. It doesn't just feel like you get your objective and then the rest of the level is filler to get to the next story point. You're given proper context and effective exposition throughout into the impending Covenant civil war that's happening. Regret has a 3-act structure. The first act culminates with the gondola ride to the underwater facility. The second act sees you moving through that facility, and the third act is the final gondola ride and eventual assassination of the Prophet. The first gondola ride is probably the least interesting stretch of this level, as it's once again a situation where you're just kinda stuck. You've gotta sit and wait for it to cross while skirmishing with a few Covenant here and there. The second gondola ride is more enjoyable, fighting against Banshees and jetpack elites en route to what you know is your final destination. During your rides through the underwater facility, Cortana provides some information about the Covenant. As I mentioned earlier, she explains that Regret arrived at Earth earlier than he was supposed to, and that he was totally unaware of the human presence there, which explains the unusually small fleet he was sent with. She later decrypts a message from Truth to Regret condemning him. Moments later, a massive Covenant fleet arrives in orbit of Delta Halo, ready to destroy the temple. The Prophet's betrayal becomes clear here, but for you, there's still a Prophet to kill. Chief has to get in, assassinate Regret, and get out quickly. The actual gameplay execution of Regret's death is pretty hilarious. You climb on his throne and just punch him in the face repeatedly until he slumps over dead, which ends the level. A Covenant cruiser prepares to destroy the temple from its orbit, leaving Regret for dead as far as the Covenant know, but Chief is caught in the blast, falling into the lake below.
This is not your grave, but you are welcome in it.
Naturally. Back at High Charity, there's a literal changing of the guard happening within the Covenant. The elite honor guards remove their helmets and hand them over to the brutes as the Arbiter looks on. Truth argues that the death of Regret proves the elite's inability to protect the prophets. Truth's scheming is becoming clearer and clearer by the second as he continues to manipulate the Arbiter. He praises the Arbiter for finding the key in their quest. After interrogating Guilty Spark, the prophets dispatch Arbiter for the sacred icon needed to activate Halo, the Index. En route to the library, Arbiter indirectly expresses a desire to avenge Regret and kill the Master Chief.
The human that killed the Prophet of Regret. Who was it? Who do you think? The demon is here? Why? Looking for a little payback? Retrieving the icon is my only concern. Of course.
Tartarus leaves him by himself to begin his quest for the sacred icon. What follows is a really bizarre mission. The first part of the level sees Arbiter making his way through and fighting scattered sentinels. He eventually arrives at a shield generator and has to fight an Enforcer, a giant flying robot guarding the library. After taking it down, Arbiter removes the shield and begins the gondola ride to the next part of the facility. This gondola ride is one of Halo 2's most beautiful quiet moments thanks to the phenomenal piece Orbit of Glass from the game's score. It's legitimately one of the most beautiful ambient pieces I've ever heard. Unfortunately, it's ruined by the re-emergence of the Flood. You hear human transmissions through Arbiter's radio somehow. They're encountering the Flood elsewhere on the ring, but you don't see any of it here. The final stretch of this mission sees Arbiter reunite with the Shipmaster and his elites and fend off waves of the Flood as we bridge to the second level of this set, Quarantine Zone. Quarantine Zone begins with the vehicle section where we learn that the Flood can operate vehicles now. I encountered a strange visual glitch throughout my original Xbox playthrough of Halo 2 for this video. It occurred throughout several missions, including this one. It made a level with already low visibility nearly impossible to navigate. I was able to bear with it each time, and the glitch would always fix itself whenever I hit a loading zone in a level, but I'm glad I never encountered it in MCC, because it was a constant annoyance throughout this game. Quarantine Zone is one of the most chaotic missions in the entire franchise. Flood are fighting the Arbiter, the Elites, the Sentinels, and the Enforcers. I find the level best played by avoiding the conflict and powering through as quickly as possible. Arbiter is in a race against the humans to retrieve the Index with another Flood infestation spreading, so I play the level with that sense of urgency. The level is also another opportunity to see the Flood's infestation damaging the Halo ring like we saw in Halo 1. The final stretch of this level is another gondola ride, this time with a squad of elites fighting the Flood alongside you. Shipmaster stays behind, and Tartarus plays politics, calling him a coward even though he stays in his phantom the whole time. Arbiter arrives at the library and finds Miranda and Johnson have already retrieved the Index. He fights them off until Tartarus arrives, who incapacitates them both and takes the Index for himself. Arbiter attempts to take responsibility for the Index, but Tartarus informs the Arbiter of the Prophet's betrayal. He casts Arbiter down seemingly to his death as the Covenant's full betrayal of the Elites begins. This is where our two stories finally converge. Master Chief and Arbiter meet for the first time, along with all those tentacles. This is our official introduction to the Gravemind, voiced menacingly by legendary voice actor D. Bradley Baker.
This is not your grave, but you are welcome in it.
Gravemind explains Halo's true purpose to the Arbiter, who's still defending the Great Journey despite being betrayed by the Prophets. This is an area where I don't quite agree with Arbiter's characterization. To me, it's less effective that he's still acting like this even after being betrayed. I'd have preferred it if his faith had become shaken gradually throughout and he'd realize the error of his ways on his own, but instead he only learns this after he's betrayed and left for dead. I still appreciate his arc, but this is where I would have handled it differently. Gravemind explains that, for the time being, the three are allies, each with a vested interest in stopping the activation of Delta Halo. He dispatches our two playable characters to different areas to stop the Covenant, splitting our story yet again. Chief is dispatched to High Charity, interrupting a sermon from Truth. Gravemind sees you fighting brutes for the first time officially. It's pretty clear from the get-go that the brutes weren't given the same amount of time and polish that the elites were as the main adversary, as they're very one-dimensional to fight. You can kill them with a few headshots, making the carbine and or beam rifle musts when you fight them. When there's only one brute left in the pack, they go berserk and chase you down. They can kill you easily with a melee attack while going berserk, and can absorb an ungodly amount of melee damage from you. Headshots or sticking them with plasma grenades are really your only tactical option, especially on higher difficulties. Brute captains wield their own special weapon, the Brute Shot. Brute Shots are grenade launchers that also have the most powerful melee attack of any firearm in the game. They're incredibly fun to use, but not so overpowered that they make you feel like you have to ignore being accurate. They're a fun inclusion and got good use in multiplayer modes like Troy. Despite this, Gravemine's one of Halo 2's highlights. You get to see the Covenant Civil War unfolding firsthand through the eyes of a human. Elites eventually join the fray later in the level, fighting you, but mostly fighting the Brutes. You can watch the Covenant tear itself apart. In another iconic moment in this game, Cortana encourages you to do just that as Breaking Benjamin's Blow Me Away plays in the background.
You might consider sitting this one out.
Exploring the Covenant Holy City as their demon is a great concept and makes for an enjoyable level, even though the Brutes in Halo 2 aren't enjoyable to fight. It's probably the longest level in the game, and it ends as Cortana warns the Chief that the Flood are coming to High Charity. At the end of the level, Truth is making his escape toward a structure in the center of the city as the Flood attack Mercy. Truth stops the Brutes from killing the Flood Spore, letting the only other Hierarch die, and seizing full control of the Covenant for himself as we leave Master Chief once again. Meanwhile, Arbiter's teleported to Delta Halo's control room and regroups with a few Elite stragglers. They find the corpses of the Elite High Counselors.
They have shed our brother's blood, and for that they must die.
This level, Uprising, is all about revenge. Uprising is one of the shortest levels in the game and also one of the more satisfying. I can't explain exactly why or how, but fighting Brutes as the Arbiter just feels easier and more enjoyable. The level's a breeze to play through, even though it doesn't really advance much in terms of story. It also reuses a lot of previous pieces of score. Halo 2 isn't as bad an offender as Halo 1 in this regard, but this level is where it happens the most. Uprising has enjoyable vehicle combat and thankfully opens the game back up a bit after High Charity's tight confines. The level ends with Arbiter and Shipmaster reunited as Tartarus has phantomized the control room. We're pulled away one more time to the Master Chief, back on High Charity. Chief meets the dying Prophet of Mercy, who informs him that Truth is headed to Earth on a Forerunner ship. The Flood arrive, and Cortana tells Chief that Gravemind used them as a diversion to give the Flood time to attack. Chief has to fight through the Flood and remaining Covenant to try and stop Truth before he leaves for Earth. Cortana stays in the ship's system with a contingency plan.
That Brute has the Index. And Miranda and Johnson. He can activate the ring.
If he does, I'll detonate in Emberclad's reactor just like we did the Autumns. The blast will destroy this city and the ring. Not a very original plan, but we know it'll work.
That kinda diffuses the tension for the rest of this game, doesn't it? Chief fights his way through the Flood-infested High Charity, not for the last time as it turns out, in a race to catch up with Truth. Truth continues broadcasting to High Charity throughout the level, lying that Mercy's right by his side as he prepares to head to Earth for a still unknown purpose. High Charity, like Uprising before it, is another brief level, and this one's ultimately an anticlimactic one. Chief leaves Cortana back at High Charity as he rides across a beam of light to the Forerunner ship. After boarding the ship, he promises to come back for her after he's finished with Truth, to which Cortana responds with her classic line,
"Don't make a girl a promise
if you know you can't keep it."
And that's it for Master Chief. If you can't tell, this level was originally supposed to end differently.
Originally, this cinematic, you were supposed to be in a Warthog, and you were going to launch yourself on the Warthog into the compartment of the ship.
The tube. There goes the
right. And again, another cool idea that we didn't quite get a chance to execute on from Halo 2, but.
With that said, this would have undeniably been a way more satisfying conclusion to Chief's side of the story, even as a Halo 1 retread like it was. What we get feels like a forced stopping point rather than a conclusion. And speaking of that, Halo 2's final mission, The Great Journey, picks up where Uprising left off. Arbiter and Shipmaster attempt to get into the control room by commandeering a conveniently placed Scarab. There's a fun opening vehicle section where you can commandeer a Wraith or a Spectre. I always go with the Wraith because sometimes you just have to blow shit up. Spectre has to be one of the most forgettable vehicles in all of gaming to me, made even more so by the fact that it's never returned in the series since. After the vehicle opening, Halo 2 gives you one of its coolest moments, fighting alongside Hunters. It's more of a novelty than actually cool gameplay inclusion, but as a one-off novelty, it's undeniably a highlight. Watching Hunters destroy Brutes with ease is just satisfying, and it's a shame that they were only an enemy again after this mission. At the mission's halfway point, Arbiter's reunited with Johnson, who's commandeered the Scarab for himself. The two form an uneasy alliance based on the mutual need to stop the activation of Halo. It wouldn't be Halo 2 without one more slow section where you have to wait around for the Scarab, so you've got to fly a Banshee around, destroying turrets and vehicles until the Scarab gets in position to blow the doors off the control room. Once inside, Arbiter confronts Tartarus and has Guilty Spark explain Halo's purpose. Tartarus refuses to believe it and begins the activation process, which leads to our final gameplay scenario in Halo 2, another boss fight. Again, I say boss fight, but this still isn't really a boss fight. It's definitely the closest to one, but you don't actually fight Tartarus. The fight just consists of waiting for Johnson to drain his shield so you can pepper him with headshots from a distance. Just rinse and repeat until you hit him enough times for him to drop dead. And that's it. That's the end of the game. Really not an exciting way to end things from a gameplay standpoint, but what about from a story standpoint? The activation process is aborted, and this unexpected deactivation sets every Halo ring on standby for remote activation. When Miranda asks where, Guilty Spark tells her.
Why the Ark? Of course.
And where, Oracle, is that?
We've got a new contact. Unknown classification.
It isn't one of ours. Take it out.
This is Spartan 117. Can anyone hear me? Over.
Isolate that signal. Master Chief, you mind telling me what you're doing on that ship?
Sir, finishing this fight.
And that's it. Cut to black, score crescendo. That's Halo 2. This ending's been discussed to death, but really it's pretty cut and dry. The game just stops, dead in its tracks. Halo 2's story at this point feels like the end of the second act as you're ramping up for the third act and the resolution, only it's missing the entire third act. Well, turns out that's exactly what happened.
So, Jones, walk us through what was supposed to happen right now.
Tragically, Jason Jones.
Yeah. Ooh. Yeah, there was supposed to be a whole mission there, Joe.
Actually, I think there were supposed to be 3 missions.
Well, there was one important one.
That's right.
Joe Staten said they cut the entire third act of the game, which would have consisted of Chief and Arbiter joining forces, defeating the Prophets and discovering the Ark together. Marty O'Donnell said this resolution was supposed to culminate on Earth and be the end of Halo as we knew it. Joe Staten, ever the optimist, hoped Halo 2's ending would be on par with The Empire Strikes Back's cliffhanger ending. But years later, he understood that the reasons that movie's ending worked were the reasons Halo 2's didn't. That movie still resolved things within its runtime. Character arcs contained within that specific movie were seen through by the end. There was a climactic battle of good and evil between our protagonist and our main antagonist. Halo 2 didn't have this. Halo 2 just stopped. Bungie said we'll get to that later and shipped the game. Halo 2's ending is considered one of the worst in gaming history, and I don't even know if I can say that. To have one of the worst endings, it has to have an ending to begin with. This game's lack of any conclusion whatsoever is really what makes it leave such a sour taste in the mouth. It wasn't even like the creative forces at Bungie made a firm creative decision that they were prepared to stand by. There was just nothing. A cut to black and credits is an ending in the literal sense in that it signifies that you're done with the thing you've just experienced, but Halo 2's campaign left a sour taste in the mouth as its final impression. Before I give my final thoughts on Halo 2 as a whole, I want to discuss Halo 2 Anniversary. This remaster was released in 2014 as part of the Master Chief Collection on Xbox One. Halo 2's cutscenes were in-engine, looking and feeling similar to the game you played. Halo 2 Anniversary's cutscenes, however, were computer-generated. They were remastered by Blur Studios, who had done CG cutscenes for Halo before. They worked on Halo Wars in 2008. Simply put, these cutscenes look phenomenal. The amount of detail Blur was able to capture in these cutscenes is astounding to me. It legitimately feels like a live-action movie at times, almost a proof of concept for how live-action Halo could look if given the blank check. I don't have complaints about the cutscenes. They make Halo 2 feel more alive than ever. How about the graphics in the game? That's a bit more of a discussion. The textures on average look good, but I do have some complaints. Some instances have incredibly harsh lighting, making some areas feel washed out and others feel too dark. I also find a bit of aesthetic inconsistency between the game and the cutscenes, which doesn't happen when the cutscenes are done in-engine. It doesn't ruin anything by any stretch, but it's an inconsistency that I always notice. The gameplay still looks good, giving more detail in areas that the original Xbox version simply couldn't. It still feels like Halo 2 at the end of the day. I've got fewer complaints here than I do with Halo 1 in terms of textures and lighting negatively impacting the atmosphere. One area where I do have varied opinions is in the remastered score. Halo 1's remastered score largely felt like straight-up remakes, while Halo 2's genuinely feels transformative, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. Sadly, a lot of the remastered score is actively worse. Unfortunately, they dubbed over Follow and Blow Me Away with similar but far less memorable pieces of score. The main issue, though, is that Halo 2 Anniversary's score is loud. Going back and forth between old and new graphics also switches the sound back and forth, and the remastered sound is far louder. They also changed many of the weapon sound effects, and I'm sure it's because of how well I know the original Halo 2, but I can't help but think the original weapons just sound better. None of the new graphics or sounds are bad necessarily, but they're transformative in ways that just don't always work. But I still appreciate the work put into this remaster, and I'm grateful for many of its changes. Halo 2 was a game limited by the hardware it was stuck on and the mistakes made during development. It couldn't have looked like this in 2004, and I appreciate getting to see another take on it. With that out of the way, it's time to put a bow on Halo 2's campaign. Let's all take a deep breath. I've had to separate the two sides of myself in writing this review. One side of me is that bored 7-year-old that played Halo 2 over and over and over again. The other is a film school grad who approaches everything with a way too critical eye. These two sides of myself feel differently about Halo 2. Let's talk about how film school grad Nick feels first. Halo 2's campaign can be a mixed bag. From a gameplay perspective, I feel far more positively about this game than its predecessor. I enjoy Halo 2's suite of weapons more. I enjoy its new mechanics. The missions don't drag as much. It integrates story with gameplay better than Combat Evolved. From a design standpoint though, Halo 2 irritates me more today than it ever has. The crazy development can be felt most when looking at the design. The two mission sets feel like a way to make the game feel longer than it is. It often feels like because they had to cut so much out, you just have to sit and wait for the game to get you to that next point. So you wait in an elevator, or ride an endless series of gondolas. You get on a Banshee for 10 seconds so you can backtrack through a level. Stuff like that happens with greater abundance and frequency than I ever realized before, and it frustrates me to play today sometimes. The brutes make the final stretch of levels feel less enjoyable because they weren't given the level of polish needed for a primary enemy. Bungie reached for the stars with Halo 2, hoping to expand on their first outing in every way possible. That core gameplay is excellent, and Halo 2 is at its best when it just lets you play. When Halo 2 is on, it's fantastic. When it's off, it's irritating. Halo 1 had a very basic story. Halo 2 aspired to be more in every way, and the story was no exception. From moment 1, characterizing the Covenant was a primary focus. For my money, the Arbiter story is where Halo 2's narrative is at its best. It effectively establishes the Covenant's power structure and expands on the ideas Halo 1 presented of the Halo rings having religious significance to your enemies. The fanatical devotion of the Covenant to their great journey being based entirely on a lie is no different from a cult. The Covenant's built on empty promises of salvation by manipulative, charismatic leaders to a populace that just needs to believe in something. The Arbiter is publicly shamed for heresy even though his failure had nothing to do with his beliefs. Even after his shaming, he's still devoted to the cause of the Covenant, leaving him blind to his ultimate betrayal. The Prophet of Truth is an excellent villain in Halo 2, a religious leader scheming his way to power, seizing control for himself, and reshaping the Covenant to his will. The Civil War in the Covenant recontextualizes the enemies you've been fighting throughout the series. Were the elites evil, or did they just not know any better? Do any of us start evil? Are we what our environments make us? Can you grow beyond that? Can you redeem yourself for the damage you've caused? Halo 2 doesn't bog itself down with these questions, but they're there to chew on if you want, and I appreciate that. Unfortunately, the human side of the story is far less compelling. Most of Halo 2's story lies with the Arbiter, and Master Chief's side of things is more focused on gameplay. To the game's credit, the best missions are found on Chief's side, but the Covenant drive Halo 2's story. Regret's invasion of Earth is the inciting incident, and his departure to Delta Halo ultimately brings our two story threads together. Master Chief may get the game's final line of dialogue, but Halo 2 is all about the Arbiter. Of course, this decision had its detractors, including those within Bungie. In response, Halo 3 would do away with this back and forth between the two characters, and it would keep them together. Even though the Arbiter was born out of a desire to simply give the game a twist, I appreciate what Bungie was able to do with this character, and with the Covenant as a whole. Halo 2's story shaped the rest of this series. Halo 1 may have been where the series started, but this game is where the story of Halo began to become what it is today. It's not always the smoothest experience, and you can tell where missions and cutscenes were removed, but Halo 2 ultimately succeeds in its ambitions of expanding the story of Halo. When I think about Halo 2, I feel more sad than anything. I know Bungie aspired to make something truly special with this game. Watching the documentary or reading interviews with the staff, everyone seemed genuinely excited at the opportunity to expand on Combat Evolved, and just as heartbroken at having to gut their game. Mistakes were made constantly in development, and they show throughout. Lazy level design, linear levels, plot contrivances and conveniences, they're all there and they all serve as reminders of the ultimately incomplete experience. Halo 2 leaves a bad taste in the mouth as its final impression, both in terms of gameplay and story. It's obvious no one at Bungie was happy with how this game shipped. They knew they just had to ship it and deal with any blowback later. Whether it was the hardware limitations, the abundance of ideas that couldn't be executed, the faulty gameplay engine, the hard deadline, the disagreements over the direction of the game, or all the above, Halo 2 is a fraction of the game it was meant to be. I long for what could have been. But that's me today. What about 7-year-old Nick? He loved everything about Halo 2's campaign. He loved driving the tank across the bridge. He loved slicing and dicing with the energy sword. He loved taking down the Scarab with the badass rock anthem roaring in the background. He loved killing everything on board High Charity. As a kid without friends, an internet connection, or many other hobbies, Halo 2 was a comfort zone for me. I knew that if I didn't know what to do, the Xbox was waiting for me in the other room, ready to take me on this adventure all over again. I can't ignore how much of an impact this game had on me back then. It's the reason I got into shooters. It endured for years as probably my most played game, and I couldn't even play the multiplayer. I loved Halo 2 in a way that I didn't love anything else, and I can't totally set those feelings aside. Every year or so, I boot that game back up to experience it all over again. Today, I may look at it differently than I did back then. Those seams might show a bit more than they did to a 7-year-old who didn't know any better, but that's okay. You can love something, warts and all. Halo 2 has a lot of warts, and I can long for that elusive perfect version of it, but what we got was what we got. I loved it then, and I still love it now despite its imperfections. But that's only half of this game. There's another half that I did not grow up with. Halo 2's multiplayer, unlike its campaign, underwent a far smoother development. Max Hoberman, the man in charge of multiplayer, said that while the game's campaign was in shambles, multiplayer had been playtested daily for over 2 years. Multiplayer had the time and development that the campaign didn't, with the sole focus being on getting the gameplay right and ensuring Xbox Live's big-ticket attraction would be a success. Xbox Live launched in November 2002, but any title before Halo 2 was just a glorified beta test. Halo 2 was the attraction for Microsoft's fledgling online multiplayer service, so expectations and pressure were through the roof. Bungie's approach to Halo 2's multiplayer would be different to Combat Evolved. Halo 1's multiplayer component was rushed out the door, but the 3 years between entries gave the multiplayer team time to create a more structured experience.
Probably the most popular team game types is Capture the Flag. Or on almost every Halo 1 map, we had 2 bases that were pretty identical. And at the beginning of Halo 2, we were trying to think of different ways where we can make our maps more asymmetrical. It's fun to play as the attacker, and then it's fun to play as the defender.
Halo 1's maps were designed to work with every game mode, making them jacks of all trades, but with no mode feeling quite at home on any one map. This seems like an oversimplification to me personally. In my own admittedly limited Halo 1 multiplayer experience, the smaller maps feel tailor-made for Slayer with their quick respawns and close quarters action, and the big team maps, while bigger than they should be, lend themselves well to Capture the Flag thanks to their scale and their symmetry. Regardless, Bungie's focus for Halo 2's maps was to build each map with a primary and secondary game mode in mind, and with years of playtesting already done, Bungie could focus on refining the maps to fit the gameplay, which was already where it needed to be. At E3 2004, Bungie revealed the first look at Halo 2's multiplayer using the now iconic Zanzibar as its multiplayer venue. Zanzibar was designed with single flag Capture the Flag in mind, with attackers starting at the beach and having 2 different routes to attack the defender base and retrieve the flag. This reveal also showed off playable elites, giving the player more customization options than ever before. One of those first 3 maps finished by early 04 was another iconic Halo 2 arena, Lockout. Lockout was a small map designed for Slayer with multiple levels of verticality to use strategically. You can see enemy players everywhere, but it can be difficult to position yourself effectively for the kill. I remember first experiencing this map with a Forge remake in Halo 4 called Shutout, and I immediately fell in love with the design. Lockout and Zanzibar, along with 12 more multiplayer arenas, would be included with Halo 2 at launch in November 2004. That month was when I had my first taste of Halo action. My family hosted Thanksgiving every year at this time, and with a large family meant a lot of older cousins at my house. Next thing I knew, 6-year-old Nick's bedroom had been hijacked by a bunch of teenagers with 4 TVs and Xboxes set up for a LAN party. I didn't play, but I made the rounds, observing every single game. The gameplay was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I was transfixed. This was the spark of my Halo fandom. The next year, I got my Xbox in Halo 1 and 2, and the rest was history. Well, as far as the campaigns go. Multiplayer? I didn't touch for 11 years until I got MCC in 2015. My own Halo 2 experience, like with its predecessor, varies from many people's. I don't have the classic memories of Xbox Live parties with friends, or custom games, or LAN parties. Halo 2's multiplayer eluded me, and I didn't get internet until years after the original Xbox servers were shut down. I think I've played on every Halo 2 map at one point or another in the last 7 years on MCC, but I'm hardly an expert. During my sessions getting footage for this video, I wasn't able to get into any big team games, not even in custom games. As you might expect, most of my Halo 2 experience is in 4v4 modes on smaller or medium-sized maps. I enjoy these though, because I feel like this is where the core gameplay shines the most. There's a reason competitive modes in Halo are largely 4v4, and that's because it's the purest gameplay. No vehicles, nothing too wacky, just a test of skill and map knowledge. Well, you can also exploit button glitches in this game, but those were before my time. As I mentioned earlier, my favorite Halo 2 map is probably Lockout, and today it's definitely my most played. Like Lockout, I first experienced many of these maps via their remakes in later games. For example, I first knew Ivory Tower as its Halo Reach remake, and maps like Coagulation and Tombstone I know better as Blood Gulch and Hang 'em High from Halo 1. Elongation's a standout map to me. It's similar to Longest from Halo 1. It offers a lot of different strategic avenues and makes the most out of its simple concept, and I enjoy it for that. Ascension and Burial Mounds are maps that I remember seeing first during that fateful Thanksgiving LAN party. Ascension's another standout map with its sniper tower and the Banshee forcing players to stay on their toes and work together to negate the power positions. Midship's another iconic 4v4 map, and it's a very enjoyable one. I'm more experienced with Zanzibar in Halo 3 as its remake Last Resort, but it's probably Halo 2's standout big team map. Those are my most played Halo 2 maps in MCC, and all in all, they're a good crop. They're also only half the experience. In 2005, Bungie released additional multiplayer maps at retail with the multiplayer map pack. It's a very primitive form of DLC, and it added 9 more maps to the game. A few that I've mentioned, like Elongation. The rest are definitely ones I haven't played as frequently. Backwash is an interesting inclusion. It's basically the final area from the 343 Guilty Spark level in Combat Evolved, bringing over a swampy aesthetic, and having Delta Halo's own Monitor flying around. Relic is a big team map I've played more in its own remakes, including Halo 2 Anniversary, which I'll get to in a minute. That's a general overview of the maps in Halo 2, but what about the gameplay? Well, it's Halo 2. The gameplay is hardly the issue with Halo 2 in either the campaign or its multiplayer. It feels just as good to play as the campaign does. Dual wielding is a must on smaller maps, and on medium or large maps you want the BR for those mid to long range battles. Overall though, it feels less one-dimensional than its predecessor. Like I said, I can't speak for how the online experience played on the original Xbox or how the button glitches affected the game, but I've had frustrating experiences with both on MCC. I can rarely get through a single game without at least one person from a team quitting. It leads to lopsided games that can take too long and you get penalized for leaving. So if you want to avoid a ban, you just have to suffer through it. The bans don't seem to have dissuaded people from leaving games enough, which is unfortunate as someone who just wants to relax and play some Halo, but has to constantly deal with lopsided games in this game. It made my time getting footage less enjoyable than it should have been. All in all, Halo 2's multiplayer is still fun, and obviously it's incredibly influential on online shooters to this day. I'm sad that my own experience with it hasn't been better, but sometimes things just don't quite work out. I don't doubt that had I been able to play this game in its original form back in the day, I would have had a blast. As it stands, I enjoy playing Halo 2 and Master Chief Collection, even though the experience is more difficult than it should be. Before wrapping up, I also want to talk about the multiplayer of Halo 2 Anniversary. This is a bit of an oddity to me. 7 Halo 2 maps are remade for MCC. Coagulation, Lockout, Relic, Sanctuary, Zanzibar, Warlock, and Ascension, with new features within that were planned for Halo 2 before being scrapped. The assault rifle absent from Halo 2 entirely was also added. Loadouts and armor customization are also included, and all these additions go along with the gameplay, which itself has been changed. Unlike Anniversary's campaign, this isn't the same gameplay with a new coat of paint. As far as I can tell, this is an entirely new game mechanically, one that's different from every other entry in the series. 343 essentially made an entire new multiplayer game within MCC with 7 old maps. The result is a game that's like Halo 2 in many ways, but also feels foreign, both aesthetically and in terms of gameplay. What we're left with is, like I said, an oddity. But I don't have issues finding matches in this mode most of the time, so it seems like people do enjoy it. It's not bad to play by any stretch, but when I play MCC, this is rarely what I go for. It's a curious footnote in the Halo series, but ultimately that's all I can say for it. So, we made it. We tackled Halo 2. I've had a long journey with Halo 2, and I don't just mean the making of this video. Most of my 24 years on this earth have had Halo 2 campaign playthroughs, probably multiple in most of those years. This game's just as much a part of my identity as a gamer as anything else, and yet my feelings are more conflicted now than they've ever been. I talked during the Combat Evolved video about how I can understand why certain elements were the way they were, but that doesn't mean I have to like them. Playing Halo 2 today, I feel a lot of that. The campaign and multiplayer are both flawed experiences today, just as they were all those years ago. I just couldn't see it back then. Today, I see a game that's desperate to be more than it is, but just can't be. I see the result of endless compromises to make an inferior vision to what was intended. It's sad seeing the burnout from all the Bungie employees at the end of the documentary. The experience of making Halo 2 left none of them happy, even though millions of gamers experienced endless amounts of joy thanks to their creation. As a creative person myself, it's my worst nightmare. All the enjoyment of my work being drowned out by my own frustration that it couldn't have been better. Bungie had high hopes for Halo 2, and they were brought back down to earth with harsh realities. The tech wasn't there, the vision wasn't unified, there wasn't enough time to refine everything. They shipped a game they knew was incomplete and would leave many people unsatisfied. And yet, Halo 2 is a classic. The multiplayer was tremendously influential and helped shape an entire genre of online shooters. The campaign, though flawed in many ways, was still well received and is beloved today for things it introduced to the series. The whole of Halo 2 has endured, and for my money, it remains greater than the sum of its parts. It's a game that still plays great today, even with all the flaws in design and the numerous corners that had to be cut. It's a game that keeps its special place in my heart to this day. It's a cathedral of gaming, but also a cautionary tale. If you're not careful, you can bring the hurricane on yourself. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time to finish the fight with Halo 3.